Hi, everyone. We are back and we are pleased to welcome Amanda Anderson from Sydney, Australia. Amanda?
Thank you. People will often ask me what happened, but honestly, I think the better question is what didn't happen. So today I'm going to take you through my story, unflinching, raw, real, and somewhat vulnerably, just so you can see how it shaped me and what hopefully we can all learn from these personal earthquakes that we all go through in our lives. So now, from the outside, you might see a woman who seems to have it all together, but every life has layers, and mine feels like 90 years compressed into 50. So, the events that I'm going to share with you today, they're not just stories, they've actually left marks on who I am. So, some shook my world, some shook my body, some shook my soul. And as I click through them, I want to give you a glimpse of what it felt like, how I dealt with it, and how it impacted my life. Not to purge, but to help those of you who've also been through some of those things feel seen. So, a little bit of a trigger warning. Some of the topics are a bit intense. So, if you do feel the need to leave or step out of the room or pause, that's totally fine. So my brother Stuart was murdered. He was beaten and killed at 16 just for having an accent. He went to a party, he was asked to turn the music down, and when he politely did what was required, others took issue. And when he responded, they heard his accent and decided to beat him and his friend up on their way home. Now, when he got home, he ended up going to the hospital with what appeared to be just a cauliflower ear. But unfortunately, it became more than that, and he actually had a brain hemorrhage, and he died. Um, his death, I mean, I was 10. His death shook me to my core. And sadly, at the age of 10, I realized that life could be cruel in ways that I just couldn't understand or explain. And my parents' grief swallowed the house. And so I knew that I couldn't ask for comfort because everyone was drowning. So I became the easy kid, the super low maintenance. I didn't want to cause any more despair. And my goal was to stay out of the way, take care of myself. I was telling myself they don't have capacity right now. So just survive the storm. Then my sister was born, and she was a tiny version of me, but fighting for breath because she was born with a lung disease called cystic fibrosis. And then what that meant was that every milestone was shadowed by fear because she was only supposed to make it to the age of 10, which ironically was the same age I was when I lost my brother. So I learned again that life is fragile, and waiting for the worst doesn't make it easier, and it doesn't prepare you. It just makes it heavier. And I think because of these early events, my parents weren't just grieving what they'd lost, they were also grieving the future that they'd imagined when deciding to have children. And I think that pain infected the air that we all breathed. So again, I decided to play small. But I think that the problem is that although being small can feel like self-preservation, you soon realize that it's actually also self-erasure. And unfortunately, it didn't stop there. Um, I fell in love. I got married. As you do, I trusted, I gave my heart, and unfortunately, it was betrayed. There was disbelief, there was shock, it was physical. I felt like my chest had been crushed in slow motion. And I think that when you suffer trauma and losing people to death, you actually find it even harder when people make the choice to hurt you. So, unfortunately, I lost my husband and my best friend that night. And then something amazing happened. A few years later, I met my second husband and my true soulmate. And that was a breath of fresh air. So it's not all bad. There was happiness, there's joy, laughter, and a deep, deep, deep love. And we immediately kicked it off. and life was great. Now, I did have a few miscarriages, 4 actually. Some were early and some were later than I would have liked. And that was heart-wrenching. And I think the gut-wrenching realization was that time after time, it wasn't happening for me. And after such highs of falling pregnant, that was a kind of grief that was different than I'd experienced before. It was a living grief. And I learned that sometimes moving forward while you're living it is actually the hardest thing to do. Now, I'm very lucky. I have 2 beautiful children who are now teenagers. Both are neurodivergent, and this has made life a constant game of navigating overwhelm and social and emotional dysregulation. We deal with advocacy and explanations and things others often don't understand. And now, in addition to this diagnosis, we have all the other bells and whistles that go with it. So, OCD, ADHD, anxiety, depression. And as I'm sure any caregiver will agree, it can be exhausting. And, studies actually show that parents of neurospicy children have the same stress levels as combat soldiers do. So it's a lot. And in addition to this diagnosis of ASD came other additional diagnoses, which added to the intricacies and had much higher reaching consequences for the whole family. And as a result, what came with that was a feeling of helplessness and terror and heartbreak and a pain that you can't solve. And supporting someone in darkness without losing yourself as well is a brutal challenge. And I know it seems like I'm listing things off here, but I do have a purpose for that. And I will explain that shortly. But I've also dealt with, unfortunately, repeated sexual trauma in my family over the years. And these events, or what I like to call personal earthquakes, they resulted for us, in sleepless nights, replaying every moment, every choice, asking if we could have been faster or stronger or done something different. And I think that kind of pain teaches vigilance, but it also teaches the impossibility of total control, which is a bitter pill to swallow. Then my father was diagnosed with leukemia, and watching him fade was literally like watching my world tilt. I felt helpless and rageful. And, he was I was his DNA. And so now I felt like I had grief laid on top of grief, laid on top of grief. And I literally watched one of my favorite people in the world slip away. And as a result of that, I then later had a stroke or a TIA, and I wasn't able to speak. My words completely left me. Faces were blank. I couldn't remember the names of loved ones. And, not only was there frustration for me, there was fear and panic for my family. And, every day, every normal day was a mountain. And I literally had to rebuild myself. And as I said, I know that this sounds a little bit ridiculous, but I'm not providing this diatribe to trauma dump or to give a laundry list of my experience. I often find that when you tell people about your experience with, say, issue Y, people will say, oh, yes, I feel very bad for you that you've had the issue Y, but you don't understand my issue Z. So I only give this list so that anyone who has experienced any of those things can know that you're actually not alone. I not that I understand what you're going through, but I have also had my own experiences in each of those areas. And so that's the only reason that I share that. And interestingly, now moving on to today, I actually chose to become a crisis responder. I'm also a mental health advocate at L'Occitane, which is the French skincare company. Now, you'd think that retail wouldn't need a crisis responder, but I supported staff who witnessed the fallout of the Bondi Westfield stabbing right in front of them, unfortunately, and a boutique manager who was threatened with a heroin kill shot. And I've seen life stop and start for people that I didn't know in moments that, most people can't even imagine. And there's adrenaline, but there's also sorrow, but it has also given me purpose. I'm also now a frontline responder for a domestic violence organisation called Four Voices Global and a keynote speaker as well. So now you'd think that one of these things on my list or in my roles would have been my aha moment. Wrong. My real aha moment came after 20 years of marriage with my soulmate, when the relationship that I built my life around came to an unexpected end. I was stunned and disoriented and grieving a life I had planned with this man for another 20 years minimum. So this revelation was a real showstopper for me. And I was staring at the pieces, wondering how was I ever going to put myself back together? And it felt like a freight train that honestly I never saw coming. And people say that the grass looks greener on the other side, but I've always believed that the grass is greener where you water it. And the problem is, I'd been too busy putting my water out for everyone else's fire that I'd forgotten to protect my own home from burning down. You have to water your own lawn and your own roof first. And while I was out there fighting fires for everyone else, the one that consumed my own home went unnoticed. And this blindsided me. We were the perfect couple, ask anyone, but our lives had become different shapes. And what we had been carrying was heavier than either of us could bear alone. And that's okay. I get it. But what happened was I slipped into functional freeze in order to cope, as I believe women so often do. And I left him alone with his pain. And it made sense to me, right? That's what I had always done. I handle mine, you handle yours. But our ways of coping didn't align, and he needed safer waters to keep his head above tide. So, in the process of losing my rock, I learned that rocks don't just shatter on impact, they also erode slowly, quietly, with constant hits. And one day, while crying in the shower, eating too much chocolate and feeling very, very sorry for myself, I had a revelation that I was my own rock, and that I had been playing small in so many ways, in so many small ways. They were almost imperceptible, almost. I'd been playing small to the universe, letting it decide what I was going to experience and what I wasn't going to experience. I kind of became the victim, strong, capable, seemingly unfazed, but a victim of circumstance nonetheless. And I'd been playing small in my relationships, in my friendships, in my marriage. And because I was so focused on what was happening on the outside, I forgot who I was. I'd been playing small with the kids, like head down, bum up, just get through it. I'd been playing small with myself, drink a bottle of wine a night. As I said, eat so much chocolate, it should have been a class A drug. I wasn't moving. I wasn't getting outside. I wasn't taking care of myself in any way, shape, or form. And I was completely closed off from my life and from myself. And once I realized this, I really looked at my life. Everything I'd been avoiding, feelings, choices, habits, everything I'd been shutting out suddenly had my attention. And this was the start of understanding my patterns, my self-erasure, and where I needed to step fully into my own life. So I got off social media scrolling and I started walking. I left voice notes for myself as I walked, realizations, epiphanies, almost like a diary. But in the process of recording them, things started to become clearer. And I could see where my negative patterns and behaviors had taken me. I had strayed so long away from the path of who I actually was, from the human, the awesome human being that I knew I could be and that I know that I am. So, taking that first step was taking a hard, long look at the roles that I played, the expectations I carried, the behaviors that I'd allowed to become habitual, and the limiting beliefs that I hadn't even realized that I held on to until my world came crashing down. And I had copious notes filled with epiphanies, because I wanted to remember them for the moments when I needed them most, right? When the proverbial was hitting the fan and my mind was spiraling, I would go back to these notes that I had made and quickly rummage through them and read all of these things and these epiphanies that I'd realized when I was in a good space. And I started catching myself betrayal. I would start to pause and ask myself, so do I want to do this, or am I doing this because it's expected or because it's what I've always done? Simple things at first, like sitting on the lounge scrolling and then having a thought, oh, it's sunny outside. I wouldn't hate going outside. And then I did it. I forced myself to do things that I actually wanted to do. So they weren't chores, but they sort of made me feel alive. I rode my motorbike, I'd put my helmet on, I'd crank the tunes and I'd just ride. I made tiny choices like, I'd make some toast and think, oh God, I wish I had a mango. So I'd say, you know what? I'll give the toast to the dogs, and I'd go and buy a mango. And that first bite was so worth it. And it was these tiny, tiny steps that created a chain reaction that gradually shifted my life. I started listening to gratitude tapes on my walks, noticing the trees and the world around me so that I couldn't stay in my head. I couldn't focus on problems. I had to be present and appreciate what I did have. And I'd meditate too, not the airy, fairy stuff, but the ones that would help me sleep when my mind raced at 3 a.m. I'd have my phone next to my bed so that when I woke up with that cortisol injection around 3 in the morning, I was like, no, meditation tape. And it would just help me go to sleep, to be honest. And I was learning to be present. So I also created a habit tracker, simple, tiny things that would make me feel better. And almost embarrassing if anyone would see it, because it would say shower, brush teeth, drink water. And I lined them up like a chain so that there was one that went to the next, to the next, to the next. So I didn't have to remember. I didn't have to motivate myself. I would just do it step by step. And, there was a period of time I remember lying in my bed and not wanting to get up, not wanting to move. And this habit tracker was like, shower. I thought, all right, it's one thing. I'll get in the shower. Tick. And then the next thing, brush my teeth. All right, I can do that. Brush my teeth, tick. And what happened is the more ticks I saw, the more it made me want to complete that list. Now, don't get me wrong. As I said, this isn't sunshine and daisies, right? These things don't fix the fact that, you lost a child or your partner left you. I know that. I know that. But it gets you out of your way long enough to do one thing better than you could have if you were still trapped inside yourself, And if you're stuck and you're unsure where to start, you just pick that tiniest step, and that's enough to start rebuilding. So it sounds so simple, but it can be really, really hard. As I said, I used to lie in bed and just really wanted to give up, but I didn't allow myself to feel guilty about it. I would lie there and think, you know what? I love my bed. I've got nowhere to be. I'm going to take away the guilt and just allow myself that moment. And it was, imperceptible, but I was rebuilding my life. So, all of these things played a part in my recovery. But I have to say that the key was reframing how I viewed myself, how I viewed my actions. My life shifted everything. And that's when the real transformation begins. So I created a system called the Pivot Framework. And what that is P is for personal earthquake. So it's the first step in the pivot method. And it's where your identity, it's where you identify the moment that shook your world, right? It's the disruption that knocked your internal compass off course. So it might have been a breakup that left you questioning your worth. It might have been a miscarriage maybe no one knew about. It could have been a job that just drained the life out of you, or you were being overlooked and dismissed and silenced, right? Simple things like someone saying, we need to talk. That could be your personal earthquake. It could be the slow grind of burnout. It doesn't have to be dramatic to be defining. So if it altered your path even slightly, it counts. That moment is your personal earthquake. And when you do this step, it guides you to be able to name that moment. And by naming it, you kind of release its hidden power, because what you're doing is creating distance from it, almost like watching it on a movie screen. And it helps dial down that emotional charge. It sort of tells your nervous system, this is remembered pain, not real danger. And so that small shift from living it to observing it, that's where the healing comes from. And that's the starting point. That's the moment that you stop being trapped in the story and you start standing beside the story. So the next letter in pivot is I, and that is identity disruption. So this is where you explore how that moment, that personal earthquake, shaped who you are or how you see yourself. People, a single word can represent that disruption, that identity disruption. And it's almost like the magnet that has been stuck to your internal compass, which is your sense of self and your true north. And that personal earthquake is the magnet that pulls you off that course. And so regaining your identity is gently peeling that magnet away and separating you from what happened to you. Okay. And see the space between who you became to survive and who you are underneath all of that. So it's that shift of language from this is what happened to me to this is part of my story, but it doesn't define me. And so that's where you start reclaiming your identity and think about who you were before this personal earthquake, who you became as a result of this personal earthquake, and what you can do with what you learnt from this personal earthquake to create a brand new you. It's not about rebuilding. Unfortunately, or fortunately, you will never go back to being the person that you once were, but you can become something bigger, better, stronger, wiser from what you've learned from that personal earthquake. V is for value recalibration. That is the moment where it's sort of like the now what moment. It's where you start to ask, okay, what kind of life do I want to build now that old one cracked wide open? Look at the values or beliefs that you took on to survive that moment. I became a fixer. I played small. I believed that being useful made me safe. I kept the peace, and all of those things, they're not flaws, right? They're strategies, and they worked once, but maybe they don't serve you anymore. And so now you get to recalibrate. You get to ask yourself now, having been through all of that, having looked at your personal earthquake, having looked at your identity, now look at your values. What actually matters to me now? Who do I want to be from here? It's funny. I live in a beautiful house, which prior to my personal earthquake, I loved and was very happy to live in. And then one day while I was going through my personal earthquake, I walked into my driveway and I looked at this house and I thought, this is almost, a joke, because it doesn't actually matter. This beautiful house now no longer matters. All I want is my family, So this is where you get to identify your core values, whether that be courage or compassion or integrity or joy or autonomy or whatever it is. It's the moment that you get to reset your compass, not toward who you were when you were surviving, but who you are in your truth. O is owning the shift. Now, this is not about taking responsibility. This is not about taking agency necessarily. It's about taking authorship of your story. It's about stepping out of the old paradigm and into the new one. You know, I choose courage over control. I speak my truth, even if my voice shakes. You know, it's about honoring the foundation. It's reframing. And I'm actually going to touch on this particular element of the pivot system in a little bit when I talk about reframing. So I will come back to that. But the reason I'm coming back to that is out of the whole pivot, which you need all of the components, that owning the shift, in my opinion and in my experience, has been the key element. So I will come back to that. And the final is T, which is true north action. Okay. Now, true north action is basically a series of small intentional movements. It's not one single leap. It's all those little things that I talked about, the habit tracker, the gratitude walks, allowing yourself to lie in bed if you feel that way. So what you want to do is decide on one honest action that reflects the new version of you, the one who's taken ownership of their story, the one who's recalibrated their values, the one who's got a new identity that they learned from the personal earthquake. So that might be saying no without guilt. It might be saying yes without over explaining. It might be, I'm going to take a nap, or I'm going to make the call, speaking the truth, whatever it is. So each action is a compass course correction, if you like. It's a small, steady way of living your recalibrated values in real life. So as I said, you're not pivoting back to the person you were, you're pivoting forward to who you were always meant to be, because you're not defined by what broke you. You're defined by what you build next. Okay. So this is the map to start. Now I'm going to touch back on the reframing, which is that owning your shift, the O in the pivot. Reframing and owning your shift is learning to see your situation differently. I learned to look at my personal earthquakes with clarity that I'd never had before. So, for example, when my child received this devastating diagnosis, everyone around us asked us all the questions that we ask in trauma, right? What did we do to cause this? How can we fix it? What does it mean for the future? You know, why is this happening to us? But I was able to reframe it, and I basically treated it like they had cancer, right? I thought, I didn't give it to them. I can't take it away. All I can do is support them and help them manage it. And that really helped me not spiral into the negativity, not spiral into the catastrophizing. You know, all the worry and all the questions that everyone was asking did nothing to improve the situation. And in fact, it actually made things worse for the child and us as well. So that reframing for me is a real key point. And, you know, when my father died, as I said, it gutted me. And I truly believed that without him, I would be forever changed. And I was. And I grieved hard. And I kept asking myself in those early days, you know, who am I without him? But when I was able to stand in my own agency and own the shift and do that pivot method, I was able to reframe that question from who was I without him to who was I because of him. And that simple shift transformed everything. Like, I stopped focusing on the loss, the grief, the missing part of me, and I started seeing, you know, what was great about him and what values he instilled in me and how I could honor him through who I become. And reframing these things made me see something incredible. All of my experiences had given me hypervigilance. I could read people before they even knew what they were feeling. You know, I noticed shifts in faces, in body language, and skin tone before anyone else. I could read a room in a second. And that hypervigilance became my superpower, right? I know who people are. And because I know who people are, I also know who I am. And even when, I know I'm jumping around a bit, but I just thought, even then, you know, when my child faced suicide ideation, it prepared me for colleagues and friends who struggled with that too. You know, as much as anyone can ever prepare for that. But, you know, when I was a crisis responder and I was dealing with that, and people would say, why didn't they talk to me? Why didn't they tell me? Because I had been there with my own child, I knew that it wasn't about anyone else. You know, it's a pain so heavy that they thought it was their only escape. So I think, you know, that reframing piece is really key. And even in my aha moment, when, you know, the love of my life said he was no longer interested, yes, it hurt more than anything else, which sounds ridiculous in comparison to everything else I've listed off, I know. But what I was able to do, it reframed me to realize I'm a bad boss bitch. I had forgotten how awesome I was. And I got back to myself and I grew and I looked at everything I'd overcome. And every single day since my brother had passed, I had succeeded, I had won, and no matter what had tried to bring me down. So that ability to see the rubble from my personal earthquakes, not as destruction, but as raw materials, as the building blocks and the starting point to create something bigger and better and stronger than I'd ever built before, that was the one thing, that was the key. And, you know, the way I see it, it's like a broken bone, right? It calcifies and it grows back stronger. We just have to look at it in the right way. So, yeah, today I try and channel that experience in helping others. I have created a human cost index program for, you know, 10,000 employees globally, alongside all the other roles that I've mentioned. And the thing that I try and teach people most is that pivot method and being able to reframe what happened to you as something that has happened for you, which I know is cliche, but I also think cliches are there for a reason because they work. And I think it's all about, if you can change your thinking, you will ultimately, and change your mindset, you will ultimately change your feelings and your emotions, which then changes your actions and your behaviors, and that changes your life. And, you know, it's okay to feel, it's okay to struggle, you know, it just takes that one step, that one moment in time. And even though you don't feel like you're going to get through it, there is another side, or there is the other side. And yeah, if you don't think you can, reach out to me. I'm happy to walk that step with you. Thank you, Lisa. That is my presentation. I hope everybody really enjoyed it and got something out of it. And as I said, if anyone wants to reach out to me, my details are on LinkedIn, Amanda Anderson, although I do have blonde hair in that picture. So don't let it confuse you. But yeah, that's it from me. Thank you.